Now, hey, I'm a young guy with a bit of an ego, but even I must admit that ranking the strategic usefulness of every tower in the entire Kingdom Rush franchise is an almost impossible task. Still, I might even attempt that someday, but let's start with something a little easier to overcome: ranking them by design. To score highest on the tier list, a tower must include 1. An original concept, both in terms of looks and mechanics, and 2. A consistent and visually appealing design. I'm Holland, and this is Every Tower Ranked by Design. First up, we have the Ranger's Hideout. Now this tower has a simple aesthetic, but I think it really works well. Also, both of the abilities, the druid that sits and summons vines, and also the fact that the archers can tip their arrows with poison, that is very aesthetic. So it's not a very complicated theme, but I think it nails the theme very well. So this has to be a B tier for me. Next up, we have the Holy Order. Now, I love Paladins just as much as the next guy, but it looks a bit too much like the regular foot soldier. So it'll have to go in C tier. Then we have the Arcane Wizard. This is a unique design, I think, and I especially love the fact that he looks like an evil mage. So he has to go into A tier. I love it when the good guys are kind of delving into evil magic and he fires a death ray, and you're kind of wondering if he even should be on your team. But yeah, I think that helps the theme a lot. Then we have Big Bertha. Now, I like the aesthetic, and I think it's funny with the little dwarf sitting on a chair. Now they've gone from throwing in the bombs to the cannon operating itself. I will still say it's quite a simple design in terms of it looking a lot like the regular bombard. So it'll have to go to D tier for me. I will have to say the towers look great. I think Kingdom Rush does such a good job with tower designs. So putting something in D tier doesn't mean I dislike the design necessarily. It just means there are more pretty and more aesthetic towers. Next up, we have the Barbarian Hall. Now, I will say this is more interesting than the Holy Order, but it's still not too special. It's just a few barbarians out in the snow. I don't know why they're out in the snow. It's a B tier. Next up, we have the Musketeer Garrison. And what I think really helps the design for me is that the tower, if it looks too much like the original tower, the original 3 stages of the tower, it doesn't intrigue me as much, and that's why I didn't put the Archer Tower here, the Ranger's Hideout, higher. But I think the Musketeer Garrison deserves an A tier because it's just so interesting. It's more creative than just having another archer. These guys have muskets, and I think the colors blend together well as well. The blue with the wooden planks, the brown planks. So I like that. Then we have the Sorcerer Mage. Now, I really wanted to put this in A tier, but I'll have to put it in B, just because I don't know what it's trying to be. He's a sorcerer, of course, but that isn't very well defined, I would say, in fantasy. It seems like he's wielding some rock magic. You can see the crystals. He's standing on a rock. He summons a rock golem. But then why can he turn enemies into sheep? I think that doesn't really fit that well. I mean, I guess the other wizard did have teleportation. I don't know if that's necessarily evil. I'm just a bit confused on what the theme behind the sorcerer is. If he was called like the Geomancer or something, I think that would actually help his rating. But I like him nonetheless. He's almost an A tier. And then we have the Tesla, of course. Now, people always put this guy in S tier when they're rating him based on his abilities. But I actually think he also deserves an S tier for just the general aesthetic. Listen, I just told you that I love when the towers divert from what they originally were. And this guy, he has nothing to do with bombs. It's a Tesla coil that the 2 dwarves are charging up. I just think that's so creative, and I love it a lot. Moving on to the towers from Frontiers. First up, we have the Crossbow Fort. Now, I like the aesthetic of this tower, and I do think it looks more different than anything we've seen before. I just struggle to understand exactly what is the aesthetic, what is a crossbow fort. Now, I'm sure there is probably some Asian cultural thing that I don't understand, and which means I'll still give it a B tier, but I just don't really understand what the aesthetic is, and maybe it could have moved up higher if it was more well defined for me. Then we have the Assassin's Guild, and when I look at this tower, I do think it's quite simple in some ways. It's just a desert building, But just the units themselves, I really think they nail the theme. Because they're thugs, so obviously they go invisible. I love that. And they have this innate ability to turn invisible so they can't be hit by rangers. They also have the thieving ability. They can steal the enemy's gold, and they can shank them, cause them to bleed. It all just fits so well into this theme that I have to give it an A tier. Then we have the Archmage. Now, the building is well drawn, but it's just a bit too generic for my taste. I think the mage is cool, but then his abilities are just the tornado and then the explosion bolts. Again, it's like, why does he have a tornado? Is he a wind mage? Or maybe because he's up in a tower? I don't really know. I think he's a bit boring, so I'm going to put him in C tier. And now, the Dwarf. And once again, our second S tier is going to be a Bombard tower. Obviously, this tower is so creative. It uses, what would you call it? It uses the movement of the earth to damage enemies. And also the two abilities it has are pretty creative. Setting the ground on fire and being able to summon a drill that insta-kills an enemy. I just think the tower design is so creative. It's such a different way, just like with the Tesla, such a different way to deal area damage than just having a bomb. Very, very good tower. S tier, definitely. Then we have the tribal Axethrowers. Now, these are quite unique if you look at something like the Crossbow Fort. I would definitely say the Axethrowers look better. They look more unique, but there is one thing I think they fail at doing, and that is diverting into more than just one theme. Because the only thing they really do is totem. They sit in a totem. The only abilities they have are totems, and that's about it. That's the whole tower. They throw axes, of course. I just think that's a little bit boring. So I will have to put it in B tier. Now, next up we have the Knights Templar. To me, this is almost as boring as the Holy Order. But I will say the building looks a bit more different than the regular barracks. So I'll put it a tier higher than the Holy Order, putting the Knights Templar in B tier. Now, I'm going to make a quick adjustment here. I'm actually going to pull down the Crossbow Fort to C tier because I think it doesn't deserve the B tier. I do actually think it hurts a lot that it doesn't have this theme. The Rangers Hideout really knows what it's doing. And even the tribal warriors here, they are totem lovers. They are tribalists. So I think Crossbow, just being in a fort, that isn't enough to settle for a B tier. Next up, we have the Necromancer. And this tower is going in S tier as well. I love the aesthetic. I love the fact that this evil wizard summons skeletons just by existing without any upgrades, and the Death Rider, which is obviously a reference to the Death Knight from the Warcraft universe. I love that. It's such a cool aesthetic. Again, the good guys delving into evil magic, I think, is always an interesting trope, and so that tower gets S tier. Another tower that also will get an S tier from me aesthetically is the Battle-Mecha. It's just so creative. It's one of the most creative, at least I'll say it's one of the first very creative tower designs in the games. In Frontiers, this was revolutionary. You never had a unit that moved around that was also a tower. And although we do see that in later titles, this was the first time it was really done. And it's done to very heavy effect or huge effect. The tower itself is pretty boring. That would be the only argument for moving it to A tier. It's just the platform where it comes up. But I'll cut it some slack because the mech itself is just so dwarven. It's so silly. Moving on to the towers from Origins, we have the Arcane Archers. Now, Origins has this very special theme. It's kind of like it's the old elven architecture. But I think it's done to an okay effect at some points. But this is an example of where I just think it looks strange. The only defining feature of these archers is that they are arcane. They have explosive arrows and they can put people to sleep. I don't know why they can put people to sleep. Is it magical sleep? That doesn't even seem like it fits as well. So I'll have to put them in D tier. It's not like they don't look cool. I do think the aesthetic fits pretty well. And again, all the towers are well drawn. The artists are very skilled. But I don't think they have that well defined of a theme. Next up, we have the Bladesinger Hall. Now, this tower does suffer from kind of the same problem as the Arcane Archers. it just looks a little bit strange. I get that it's elven architecture, but it just doesn't really fit. I don't think we really see an elven village in Origin that's built like this. It's more just the artists were told to draw some strange architecture, and it doesn't look that great, I would say. Although the color scheme in this drawing is better than the Arcane Archers. I do think the red and the yellow and the beige color, that does blend together very well. So I think the Bladesinger Hall gets a C tier. It looks better than the Arcane Archers, but it's still not that very well defined. It's just they are rogues or fighters maybe, and that's it. Then we have the Wild Magus, or Wild Magus. No, it should be Magus, right? Okay, I don't know. The Wild whatever. This lady shoots fireballs, and I think she was the first tower in the games who had this effect, the same effect that Blazing Gem has, where she gets more powerful, starts dealing more damage the more she attacks. Although I will say that is communicated very poorly, at least to my eyes. I haven't been able to notice any visual changes. So it's quite hard to follow along that she's dealing more damage, where the Blazing Gem has a really neat visual feature where it powers up its beam. So it was a first attempt, and that is a creative ability. I will give them props for that. Also, we're not rating based off so much gameplay as in visuals. So I actually like the Magus better than the two other towers, and I'll give her a B tier just because the flying island aesthetic is kind of cool. She has kind of like an airbender, firebender kind of vibe, and I think it works. So she's solid, nothing more. Now, this tower, the Arch-Druid Henge, I really love this tower, and I so wanted to give it an A tier, sorry, an S tier even. I think the abilities are spot on. I love that it can summon a bear, and it has this other druid spell curse. It isn't necessarily very druidic, but it's a cool ability where it can curse an enemy to where when it takes damage, the damage is dealt to surrounding enemies, which obviously also fits in with the tower being a bombard type tower. It's supposed to deal area damage, but I think just the three druids, it being kind of a druid circle, that is so cool, and I really wanted to give it an S tier, but I don't think it deserves it. I think it deserves an A tier just because it isn't that much different from the regular version of the tower, the first three levels. It is the same guy throwing the rocks. So I do think it doesn't quite deserve S tier. Now we have the golden longbows, and it's funny how the archer towers usually get pretty high ratings, I would say. The musketeers here and the rangers are pretty high up, but this will get a D tier from me as well. I don't think the longbows are that unique. Now, they're drawn well, and I like they are kind of like the muskets, and I do like that in the fact that they shoot very far. But the problem is that still the building just looks good, but it isn't. What's the theme of the golden longbows? What's the theme? What's the theme of the golden longbows? I don't know. It's just a lady with a bow, and also her two abilities to me kind of feel like they do the same. I think one of them gives every attack a chance to insta kill, which I love a lot, and then the other abilities is like a mark, is a hunter's mark that makes the enemy take increased damage. I just, that isn't very interesting as well. It doesn't play. What's the theme? She's a marksman. Okay, fair enough, but I don't think it's sold to me very well. Now, this is a cool tower. I like the forest keepers a lot. They do lower the amount of barrack units you have to 2, and I think for gameplay purposes that can be quite tough to deal with. But I think that's unique as well. I like the barrack units trying to have more or less than just 3 units in the barracks. So that's cool, but aesthetic-wise, which is what we care about, I think they just look cool. They're kind of like, what are these fantasy creatures called? They remind me of, like, not centaurs. Is it no, they aren't centaurs. Satyrs, maybe, yes. Although I thought those were evil. I don't really know what fantasy creatures they're supposed to be, but they really play into this theme of being forest keepers. They live in a mountain grove. They're covered with green, which also, again, that reminds me of nature. All their abilities are healing and vines, also a reference, I would say, to the first game with the Rangers Hideout. It all just plays very well into the theme, and although I don't think I can give them S tier, I will give them A tier. Next up, this is the High Elven Mage, and see, I like this aesthetic more for an Elven aesthetic. The Arcane Longbows, they seem more like, I don't know, they seem more sci-fi to me. like a lost civilization that came with like spaceship. They remind me of the Draenei aesthetic from World of Warcraft, where this tower is more, what is that series called? Lord of the Rings-esque. This, and I assume it's inspired by that, the elven cities there. And I just think that works better. I think it's more well-defined of a theme. So I'll give this B tier, although I can't give it any higher because I don't think the abilities and the tower really play into an aesthetic that well. It's just a mage tower, an elven mage tower, and I think it looks good. And now we have the Weirdwood. And I love this tower. I just love that it's a tree. Now that may sound way too simple to be creative, but coming from a druid throwing a rock, having the tower turn into something completely different, a tree, I actually love that. And it's if you had to sell this to someone as like an idea, maybe this is how they got the tower into the game in the first place. You'd sell it like this. You'd say it's a tree that throws its own acorns at enemies. And just the way it pulls the acorns out of its hair, it's lovely. I really like this tower, and I do think it deserves S tier. Although I will say I love both of the artillery towers from Origins almost equally. I just think that the tree is even more unique than the Arch-Druid. Hey, if you liked the video so far, why not consider subscribing? We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers. Thanks. Next up, we're moving to Vengeance and talking about the Shadow Archers. Now, I don't know why the name is plural. It's just one archer, but anyways, who cares? It's a boring design, I would say. It's not that interesting. It's just a guy in a tower, and we've seen too much guy in a tower already in Kingdom Rush for this to be interesting. So although the crow sells it for me, and by sells it for me, I would say it saves it from D tier, because I just love the little crow flying over to peck at the enemies. So that goes in C tier. Next up, we have the Orc Warriors Den. Now, this tower is very basic as well. Obviously, we're playing the bad guys now, and we need evil towers. We need evil soldiers. I don't know if they could have done anything more with this barrack, with this tower. Maybe it should just be simple. I think the Shadow Archer definitely could have been more interesting, or had a more interesting design. But the Orc Warriors Den probably could have as well. I like the fact that you promote one of the units, just one of them, not all of them, with one of the upgrades, but to a war chief, obviously. But that doesn't save it for me. I think it's still pretty basic. Then next up, the Infernal Mage. Now, I really want to put the Infernal Mage in B tier, but I can't, because it suffers from a problem that, while researching this video, came up multiple times, which is a problem I originally thought just was lack of distinction between abilities. That's what I want to call it. Now, if you think of a tower like, let's say, the Necromancer Tower. He has two upgrades. He can summon a Death Knight, and he can summon a Plague Cloud. Those are the two distinct abilities. Now, you're never going to mix those up. You know which one is the Death Knight and which one is the Plague Cloud. But when I look at a unit such as the Infernal Mage, he has three abilities that all revolve around fire, and I can barely remember them. I think one teleports enemies, which somehow is flame related. Then he has one that reduces resistances, and I think he can summon a rune that blows up or something. And they're all fire-related abilities, especially tough to differentiate because all three icons look like fire. They're orange. So I never know which one to click. Now, I don't want to talk too much about this tower, but I will just say this is a problem for multiple towers, as we'll get into later on. And it's always the fire towers. And it really pulls it down for me. I want to give it a B, but I can't. I have to give it a C tier because it just annoys me too much. And again, the theme, it's kind of the same problem as with the Tribal Warriors. It has to differentiate itself more, the tower. It can't just be fire. And I think, sadly, the Infernal Mage has a little bit too much fire. Now, the Rocket Riders, maybe finally we can start giving something more than a C tier from Vengeance. It's funny, right? Because these three towers, the first three towers in Vengeance, I think they get a C tier. But actually, Vengeance has some of my favorite towers in the entire series. And I know that's kind of blasphemous in this day and age, because obviously Frontier is the best game, and we all know that, and yes, guys, I get it. But Vengeance did do something right, which is that I think they tried very hard to make creative towers, obviously so you'd buy them, but still. Now, with all that said, I don't think the Rocket Riders are bad at all, but they don't really feel like a tower to me. There's something about the whole tower aesthetic being, especially in the earlier upgrades. I think this version, the final version, does rescue the theme a bit, but the earlier versions where it's just a launch pad, it doesn't feel really like a tower to me, which is why I'm only going to give it a B tier, even though it is very goblin-esque with the whole thing where you fire the goblin on the rocket. I think that's a great aesthetic, or a great idea at least. I just think it could have been done better visually. And now we have the Dark Knights. Now, these guys are cool. They have the chain swords. I think they are seen in Warhammer. And they look very menacing. They have this dark black and red aesthetic. And the abilities as well make them really feel like tough fighting units that can withstand a lot of hurt from the enemies. Why I don't think they deserve an A tier is because the building just doesn't really seem like a building to me. And it's kind of the same thing as with the Arcane Archers and with some other buildings. Sometimes the designers just make something and it'll become even more apparent later on. But it doesn't necessarily look good. Now, it looks good. This tower looks good, but I don't know what it's supposed to be. Is it like a dungeon? Is it a forge? Is it just an evil-looking house? I don't know what it's supposed to be. So the theme is dark and menacing, but something's missing, definitely. And then we have the Melting Furnace. Now, this reminds me a lot of the DWAARP. The DWAARP, I don't know what it's called. I think I said it right earlier. But it sends shockwaves through the ground, and I don't really know how it does this. It's just a furnace, but it still looks kind of right, and it's a really cool idea. So while I can't give it S tier, also because the DWAARP, it's probably DWAARP, right? The DWAARP already did this, but even so, I will still give it A tier, because I do think it's a creative design, and it does have some cool abilities. And now we have the Spectre's Mausoleum. When I saw this the first time I saw this, I think I saw it in a YouTube video before I ever played Vengeance for myself. I just thought this was such a cool tower. It's a house that holds souls. It's kind of like a haunted house, and it really goes hard into that aesthetic with beautiful coloring as well, I will say. That shoots souls from inside of the house. I just think that's so creative. That's so unique. And also the abilities, although one of the abilities is practically useless, letting you store up more souls, and I wish it did more than that. The other two, letting the tower possess an enemy and also summoning gargoyles to protect, to block enemies on the path, I think those abilities are really creative. So I'll give this an S tier, definitely. Now we have the Goblin Ranks, or Goblin Ranks, I think they're called. I think this is just a very standard, basic, good-looking tower. It has a cool aesthetic, but it doesn't really do a lot with it. It's just a goblin tower, and its abilities feel a bit random. It has a stun chance, which is a really fun ability to use, but I don't know how it's very goblin-esque. And then they can throw bees, which might just be for the heck of it, because they are goblins after all. Maybe they're just using whatever they have at their disposal. That is goblin-like, I would say. And then they have the giant saw blade they can throw out, which is goblin-like and also fits with the tower. So it's just not that well defined of a theme, but I'll still give it B tier. Now we have the Bone Flingers. Now I love to use these in combat, and they have great voice acting. They're so funny. They have the same problem, I would say, as the tribesmen here, and maybe the Infernal Mage, in that they just have one theme, and now their theme is bone, or a skeleton maybe. So they can summon a skeleton, they can put calcium into their bones to deal more damage, they can summon another skeleton, they have two abilities to summon skeletons, and then they just stand on a fossil, because, I don't know, it was supposed to be bone themed, which is cool, and it's like, I don't mind that. I think it's a cool tower. It looks good, but I'm not gonna give it higher than B tier because it doesn't really make sense. Why are they standing on a fossil? It just has to fit into the bone theme, and I think that's a little bit lazy. Although still, I love the aesthetics of the tower. And now for another B tier tower, the Elite Harassers are going to B tier. Well, obviously these guys were seen in Origins as well, so it's cool to see them again. I think the problem is especially with the building. This last iteration particularly, I don't know what this is. It does look evil, and the Harassers turn evil. They have this vengeance ability where they come back to life after they're killed. That does fit together pretty well, but I don't know what the building is supposed to be. Again, is it a keep? Is it a castle? It's just their house? I don't know. Something doesn't really feel connected to me, so that's why they don't go higher than B. Now, the Orc Shaman, he has this really cool aesthetic where he's standing on a pile of bones, but it makes more sense than the Bone Flingers, because he's like this evil shaman, and he could have just as well worn like a skeleton mask. I don't know, it just fits for me. What really sells it for me is his primary attack. I love the creativity behind it. Usually the mages especially, they fire magic out of their hands, and that's about it. But this guy, he summons the lightning that he summons from the sky. So he's just raising his hand and then summoning lightning on the enemy. And you know that he's the one attacking, even though his attack isn't connected to the tower because it's so distinct. Obviously, the shaman is the one calling down thunder from the sky. So, very aesthetic, very cool. He has to get an S tier for me. And now we're getting to the Grim Cemetery. You can start to see maybe that we're getting into some of my favorite towers from Vengeance, and in general, in the entire series. The Grim Cemetery, I think, is so original. It doesn't do a lot. I was very confused when I purchased it first time, because it just sits there. It doesn't summon any units. It doesn't have an attack. So I was confused what it was supposed to do. It's the only tower that doesn't really do anything. Well, except for when enemies die around it. And I think it has to be around it, although I am a little confused on how the skeletons spawn, or the zombies spawn around it, because sometimes it feels like they just spawn randomly as well. But no matter the case, the cemetery resummons enemies that die around it as undeads. And I think that's so cool. I know we already had the resurrection element from the Necromancer, but I think the graveyard does it in a totally new way. And it's zombies, not skeletons, so it does differentiate itself in a major way in that sense. It gets S tier for me as well. I love it, and I think the abilities does fit the Night of the Living Dead aesthetic as well. And now to the Rotten Forest. I want to give this one S tier as well. There is just one pretty big reason I can't, and that is its attack doesn't feel good. And I think my conspiracy theory is that it has a very visually non-appealing attack because it can place its roots in strange terrain. And that's the problem with making a tower defense game with levels that has different terrain. Sometimes it looks a bit strange to have the roots sitting in the ground and attacking the enemies. But what really just happens when enemies walk over the roots is that the tower does this weird pulsating animation, I believe, and then the roots do the same thing, I think. Now, it's really cool, and I love, it's such a creative thing having the tower just place roots around itself, and that's what's dealing damage to the enemies. It's the same thing as the DWAARP. Not the same thing, but it's creative in the kind of the same way, where the designers thought, okay, how can we make a tower that deals area damage? And then someone said, oh, I know, how about we make the tower be a tree, a withered tree that has its roots growing all around it. I think that's so cool. And the abilities are cool as well. It can summon a fog that makes enemies have a chance to miss. And then it can summon undead trees inside the fog. It's like a whole horror movie by itself. Oh, it's so cool, and I really want to give it S tier. I'm really actually still considering it, even though I thought I was sure to give it A tier. You know what? I'm going to give it S tier. I think the abilities are just so spot on. They save it for me. So even though I wish the roots were bigger, I still love the Forest. Now we have the Ignis Alter. This tower does look pretty basic. I thought it looked pretty basic the first time I saw it. It has this one cool thing where the tribesmen are sacrificing eggs to anger some god. And I just think that's cool. I love unique ways of attacking. Kind of like how these fellows are just operating an oven or a furnace, and then the furnace attacks around them. I just think that's cool. So to me, that actually does help the tower a lot. It can't get S tier because it suffers from one huge problem, and we've talked about it before. It's the all abilities look like fire problem. I think it's less severe than with the Infernal Mage, but it's still a problem. It has a fire golem, then it has a fire attack, which makes every attack leave like a patch of fire on the ground that burns enemies. I love that ability as well. I love when abilities just apply to the attack in general. And then it has a ability, I believe, that infects an enemy, making it take more damage, and then exploding when it dies. But they all seem like fire abilities. You look at them, then you have to read the abilities because you can't immediately tell. It's not very visually appealing. which ability is which. So with all that said, I still love the tower, and I think the abilities are cool as well. I do think it gets an A tier. And now for the Deep Devil's Reef. I think most people like the aesthetic of this tower, and I do as well, I'm no exception. I love that it's in a little pond, and I know a few other towers are as well, the Infernal Mage, but I think this is done better. I think it looks more like it's sitting in a pond. And obviously the tower is cool in that it can shoot magic, and it can summon barracks units as well. Now, the abilities are cool as well. The mage can summon a cloud that shoots lightning at enemies. And what I really like about the tower specifically is that it feels like you don't really get to play with these Naga folk, sea folk, in the Vengeance that much. I believe this is the only tower that features them. But it feels like you really get to control the Naga race, because you both have the spellcaster, obviously shooting magic, and then you have the warrior units. And I like that. It really fills multiple roles for me. So it doesn't quite get S tier. It does get an A tier though. Now, next up we have the Shaolin Temple, and I'm definitely saying that wrong. I think this visual design is just so pretty. I think at all levels, and also including the last level here, the tower just looks great. It has beautiful colors, and it's very symmetrical, which I think it looks great. I think it's a beautiful tower, and it also has such a cool attack. Before I got the tower, I was wondering what it was going to do, and I just thought it was going to be a barracks tower that summoned these monk warriors to the road, and they were going to fight like regular barrack units. But that's not what the tower does. It summons these monks to attack enemies either in the air or on the ground, and then they return. So it kind of ends up becoming an AoE tower, but it's a unique kind of artillery because it can hit in way larger ranges, and then I assume it's dealing less damage to compensate, although it is a paid tower, I believe, so it could just be completely broken. Now it gets an S tier from me because I love the visuals and I love the unique design. Also the abilities fit pretty well. Next up we have the Blazing Gem. Now I could put this in S tier, but I won't, because I do think the aesthetic doesn't look as cool as some of the other towers in S tier. It is a really cool design, having multiple sorcerers that have to work together to summon the power of this shrine. Now the shrine itself, it's a bit too red, and the fellows being the ritualists being in red as well, I think that's too much red. But it's still a cool tower. It's a really cool tower. It has a cool idea, and it's done, I would say, quite a lot better than the Magus, the wild Magus from Origins, in which I talked about earlier, in the way that it displays how much damage it's dealing, powering up slowly, dealing more damage the longer it attacks. So it's a bit too much red, and there's something about the shrine that doesn't really work for me, but it still gets an A tier because it is a cool design. Now for the next tower, the Wicked Sisters. This is such a cool aesthetic. They could have really screwed that up. It could have been so boring. It could have just been a witch standing on a witch's hut shooting witch bolts. But it's two witches. It's the Wicked Sisters working together. One of them is brewing a pot of some concoction, and then the other one is flying on a broomstick, obviously, and you can position her wherever you want. So she's kind of like a more mobile version of the Battle-Mecha with a single target attack. Then you can swap between two different attacks with the potions. Now, I don't really know how tactically useful that is. I don't understand when you would use the one ability over the other, the stun over the poison, but that doesn't matter because we're not talking about tactics, we're talking about aesthetics. And I just love the whole, she's turning stuff into animals, she's polymorphing them obviously, and then she's throwing different potions. It's just so aesthetic, and it just really fits into this theme of being a witch's hut. So definitely an S tier aesthetic. Next up we have the Swamp Thing. Now I love this tower, I love using it, I love that it has a huge range, and also that it stuns enemies when it hits them. It can also get out of the pond, which isn't that useful, but it's cool, and it's a really cool design, so it helps, for me it helps the tower get up to A tier. It doesn't get higher, I think it lacks some sort of aesthetic, but really you couldn't ask for much more. The Cthulhu type monster hiding in a pond of deadly goo, I don't know how you could make that more aesthetic. I just think some of the other contenders up here just does the theme a little bit better, but it's very close. Next up we have the Goblin War Zeppelin, which I already love, but also just the tower itself, it has like this little landing bay, which is much more cool than the Battle-Mechas, just coming out of the ground construction zone. And then it has this giant balloon, it has a goblin on top, And I don't remember, I think he's even added after you upgrade the tower. So each upgrade of the tower causes the balloon to do something different. It has nothing to do with the tower itself, which is cool. You're outfitting the Zeppelin with a new ability. And that's just great, and I think it looks great. I do have to put it in S tier as well. You can tell how much I love towers from Kingdom Rush, especially Vengeance towers. Vengeance gets a lot of slack, but wow, does it have beautiful towers. And now we're moving on to one of the expansions for Vengeance, the Hammerhold expansion. It's the Sandworm Hollow. This tower is really cool. It was seen in Frontiers as well, but I do have one problem with it, and it's that it attacks in a strange way. It summons, I think, spikes from the ground. That's its basic attack, where you'd think it would eat the enemies because it's a worm that's hiding underground. It doesn't do that. Maybe it could have spat something out of its mouth, but no, it's summoning these strange spikes, which is, I don't know if it's good for gameplay purposes. I haven't tested the tower that much, but it's a bit of a swing and a miss, I think, just in terms of aesthetics. I think they had a great idea with having the worm be the tower for the expansion, but I think it was a bit overambitious, and Ironhide usually doesn't do this. It usually follows up very well. It makes the Battle-Mecha, which is actually a tower that moves around and it feels good to use. This Sandworm Hollow, it doesn't do its job very well. So great idea, maybe even an S tier idea, but it only gets a B, because the basic attack, it just doesn't do it for me. And the one ability it has where it can swallow enemies whole, I think that maybe that should have been the primary attack, and now obviously balanced for how powerful that could have been. And now for the most recent update to Vengeance Pirate Kings, we have the Ogre Shipwreck. Now, I've talked about the Ogre Shipwreck in my video on Alliance, so I won't go into too much detail, but what's cool about this tower is that it gains a new ability on each upgrade just by upgrading the tower regularly, where I think every other tower in every other game gains nothing from going from level 1 to level 2 to level 3. So that's really cool. I think the one flaw with the tower is that the better crew upgrade does not visually improve its soldier units. So the tower has 2 soldiers, a big brutish orc and a little goblin, and when you upgrade their stats with one of the abilities on the tower, they do not gain new visuals, and I don't like that. I think that's lazy. But the whole tower isn't lazy. It is really cool, so I will still give it an A tier. The whole aesthetic with a crew of orcs, or ogres I think they are, having taken over a ruined shipwreck and making it their own slowly over time, I think that's so cool. And finally, we have Kingdom Rush Alliance, the newest game in the series. And we're starting off with the Royal Archers. Now, I don't like this tower. I think it's boring. I think it looks too much like the regular Archer Tower from the first game. And I get that it's royal. It has kind of this Legends aesthetic that we've slowly been delving into since Vengeance. I think it looks too cartoonish. It's too goofy. It just doesn't appeal to me. It doesn't look very interesting. It's just a guard tower. It's just a guard tower. And now it's royal. Okay, fair enough. Kind of the same thing with the Paladin Covenant. I think this has already been done. And I think it was done better in the first Kingdom Rush game. I more like the Holy Order, which is just one tier up higher. Again, look at the difference here. We've gotten into something much more cartoonish, much more light. I don't like that personally. I do like the more gritty theme of the first game, or the first few games, the more gritty visuals, and they weren't that much more gritty, but a little bit. And I think this has already been done. So the Paladin Covenant is just a cheap copy to me. Now, even the Arcane Wizard here, which I do think a lot of people like. I don't know why I think that. There's just something about it. I feel like people would like this tower more than the others. It gets a D tier for me as well. It's kind of funny how we've gone from the first 3 towers in Vengeance being C tier to now, at least for me, the first 3 towers in Alliance being D tier. Now, I just think the one big problem with this Arcane Wizard, which again is a copy, these 3 towers do feel like copies, all of them, from the first game. The problem with this Arcane Wizard is that he lost the whole evil aspect. Look at this Arcane Wizard. Okay, maybe he does look kind of innocent, but that beam is not innocent. And the abilities he has is like a death ray. So he's kind of up to no good, and I think the king may be worried that he's going to betray the whole kingdom. This Arcane Wizard, he just looks like, well, he looks like the bishop character from the Legends. I think he is an Arcane Wizard as well, but I hate the new aesthetic of the Arcane Wizard. Why is he just a normal mage? You ruined it. He was supposed to be evil. So that just ruins it for me. I don't know, I like the original way better. Now, okay, fair enough. Every tower from Alliance can't be D tier, So the Tri-Cannon, I'm gonna put it in B tier. It looks kind of like the Bombard Tower. It doesn't look like it, but it has the same general aesthetic, but it does do something interesting, which is fire multiple projectiles, and I just think that's cool. It could have been a C tier, but the multiple projectile feature saves it. I think it does raise it up 1 tier, because we've never really seen that before. Now, this tower I actually like a lot. It's the Ballista Outpost. Not only is it fun to use in game because it has a stun and it also has an AoE scrap bomb, it also just feels so goblin-esque, and unlike the rocket riders here, this actually feels like a real tower, a giant crossbow that the goblins would build. And obviously the goblins are building a giant metal crossbow because they're goblins. So I love that a lot, and I think the whole aesthetic does work very well. It's an A tier for me. Next up we have the Arborean Emissary. He looks, in his first 3 levels, like an absolute buffoon. I don't know if I'm the only one who's noticed this or who thinks this, but his tiny little arms, they're just glued on. They look like they're glued on like some sort of action figure. I think he looks so silly. Thankfully, the last version does cover that up a bit, and he gets bulkier arms, I think. It does look better, but I hate the tiny arms. Just get rid of that. Now, aesthetic-wise, he's a druid. He's shooting magic. That's cool. The magic lowers the enemy's armor. That's original as well. So I do think he has a lot going for him. But he's not going to get higher than B tier for me until you fix those goddamn arms. I do understand things look quite bleak for Alliance, but this tower, the Demon Pit, it's going in S tier. Now, the only thing that's maybe could be considered a problem with this tower is that it is very silly. You can see there's a what is that? A ball? What is that? Like a water ball? That's not what it's called. Okay, I'm tired, clearly. There is some kind of ball in the pit for playing games. And also one of the abilities is the giant demon who jumps out of the pit. He's holding like his bath towel. It's kind of silly. And I think they could have actually made this tower more serious if Alliance had been more serious. So in that sense, maybe this tower should be A tier. But I just love the aesthetic. It's a demon pit. It's a demon pit. That sounds so evil. And it's just... they're having fun. They're just swimming in a pool. It's the demon pool. And then when one imp jumps into the pool, the other one goes flying out and runs along the path, which is also a cool feature. It's a blocker. It's a tower that shoots blockers. It shoots the blockers. Usually the barracks towers just summon them to the road. Now they're being shot out of a cannon like a normal tower. It's just so cool. It's so creative, and I do have to give it S tier for that. Now, the Dwarven Flamespitter is actually a really creative tower as well. We haven't had a proper flamethrower tower yet. I would give it A tier, probably, but it does suffer from 2 problems. First of all, the attacks they don't feel that good. When the flame shoots out, I can't really put my finger on it, but I think some of you may agree with me here. When the flame hits, it doesn't really feel like it always hits the enemies it should. It doesn't feel like a proper flamethrower tower. I think maybe it's because the tower has, I think, 8 set angles it can be at, but the flame can be at more than 8 angles, so it kind of looks strange when it shoots. But they tried their best, and it does get B tier for that. Now, the other problem is it suffers from the same... it does only have 2 abilities, but it suffers from the same fire tower ability problem that I have with all the other towers I've covered previously. The 2 towers, the 2 abilities it has are so similar. I think one shoots a fireball and the other one shoots flame pillars. And it's like, okay, fair enough, but those are just the same ability twice for me. So I'm not really sure if I like that, but I think it's a cool tower nonetheless, and it is quite creative, so it does get B tier. And then we have the Rocket Gunners. Now, again, in terms of originality, this tower does do a very good job. It has these marine soldiers, kind of looking like something out of Warhammer. And it's a barracks tower that can have the barracks units both be on the ground and they can fly. And that's original as well. So I like the aesthetic. I think it's creative. It doesn't overly surprise me, but it does get an A tier. Now we have the Eldritch Channeler. And I think if this tower came before the Blazing Gem, it could have done better. Now, actually, I do like the Blazing Gem better because it has these 4 ritualists having to work together, summoning the power of this Blazing Gem. And that's more cool than just having another wizard who can summon the power of his own gemstones up here. But the tower itself, him flying on some rocks with runes on them, I do like that better in some ways than the Blazing Gem. Although because the Blazing Gem already did it and they're both red and they do the same thing, it's kind of the same tower just copied. I don't understand why they didn't differentiate it more. Because of that, it does get just a B tier for me. Next up, we have the Battle Brewmasters. And even though I don't like Alliance as much as previous games, I will say Ironhide still does do creative towers. We've already talked about the Demon Pit, and I think this one is almost just as creative. It's the Battle Brewmasters. Now, my only problem with it is that it feels like the primary attack shouldn't do an AoE attack. It does have a very huge range, which is nice for gameplay purposes, but it's just a barrel. It doesn't explode like I feel like it should if it were an AoE attack, which it is. Other than that, it has a secondary ability. The primary attack, I think it lowers the damage of whoever it hits. Although I don't know how you're supposed to figure that out. I looked at the wiki. Whatever, who cares? It just isn't communicated that well, I feel, in the game. Other than that, it's a very creative tower. It looks great, and it has a summon as well. That looks good. So the only reason I'm not giving it S is probably because it doesn't communicate its primary attack that well. But it really is cool, and it's such a creative design, just having a drunk dwarf throwing his barrels. And yes, I do know it is probably a reference to a certain comic. Now we have the Dune Sentinels, and these just feel straight out of Frontiers, which is always a good thing. They don't really have anything else going for them. I love that they can generate extra gold. Those kind of abilities are very intriguing to me, but that's more on the gameplay side. I just think they look good, and that's about it. I love that they're straight out of Frontiers. Maybe they even should be C tier, but they do really look cool, especially in the first 3 forms. I actually don't like the final form that much, so they're on the edge of C tier. But I think that it is a solid tower. Now we have the Elven Stargazer. Now, remember how much I talked about Elven architecture and how I really didn't like it, except for maybe the High Mage? I think the Elven Stargazer actually does it better than basically all of the Elven towers from Origins, and I'm sure I'm gonna get hate for that because Origins is clearly a better game than Alliance was. But this tower is great. It really fits in the moon theme. It goes into the lunar theme. It has this moon star that the priestess is praying to, and then it shoots out stars, and I think one of the abilities shoots out more stars when the enemies die. So it's very lunar, it's very in theme. This feels more like a shrine you would see in a normal fantasy setting than I even think Blazing Gem does. I think Blazing Gem is a strange kind of shrine, where this feels really like a shrine. If that makes sense. That probably doesn't make any sense. Anyway, I think that it does make the tower good enough to deserve A tier. Now we have the Necromancer again, and I don't like these copies of towers. I actually do wish they just came up with new towers, unless they had a unique take on the tower, but all of these Alliance towers are just copies of the original. They do get new abilities, some of the newer towers, but I don't know how much I like it. I feel like this is just a cheap way of bringing people back, because people love the original Necromancer. I still have to give it A though, and that is despite my best judgment, because I want to put it lower, but it does look good. And the skull here is so much cooler than the original when you put them side by side. I just think this, I do like the original better. I think this new version looks a bit more goofy. His abilities are cool. I like the originals better, but the horseman riding down the trail is cool. And although the goofy aesthetic definitely pulls it down for me, maybe should even be closer to B. I just can't deny that the visual design of, let's just say, the skull, because that's the only thing I'm sure about, it is definitely better on the newer version. And next up we have the Grim Wraiths. There is something about this tower that I just don't like. Now, I should like this tower. It should be A tier, or maybe even S tier for me, because when you describe it, it's 2 spirit wraiths with their cutlasses going around fighting enemies. They can even swap with other towers, which is cool, although it is... No, that is a cool ability. It's very overwhelming, but it is a cool ability. I should love that tower, but I just don't really. And I think it's something to do with the units themselves. To me, they feel... I don't know if this resonates with any of you. To me, they just feel downscaled in some strange way. They don't feel like real blocker units. And also the tower itself is just, I think, the worst offender of towers that just look like a cool shape. I have no idea what this shrine thing is supposed to be. I assume it's supposed to be just storing the Grim Wraith's souls. So it's like a spirit totem. But it just looks strange. It doesn't resemble anything to me, maybe other than a Draenei spaceship. So I will give it C tier, but I think this is a tower that had much more potential than, to me, it ended up achieving. And lastly, we have the Twilight Longbows, the most recent tower when making this video. I love the aesthetic of this tower, and I like it a lot more than the Golden Longbows, even though they do kind of do the same thing. This tower has a really cool animation where the Twilight Longbow on top, she pulls back her bow, and you can really tell they put a lot of thought into this animation and a lot of effort. And again, I guess that is a reference to the Golden Longbows, I just realized, because it's called the Twilight Longbows, but I think the Twilight Longbows does it so much better. It has these elite harassers as well from the previous game, from Vengeance, that it can summon onto the road, which is cool. And then it has this amazing ability, which I guess I can't talk much about because this is a design video, but it does have a cool design feature where when the Twilight Longbows kill an enemy and you have bought this upgrade, a little orb is summoned from the corpse of the enemy, and the Twilight Longbows collects this orb, and then it becomes stronger permanently, which is a really cool ability, and it does have a cool visual accompanying it. I'm not going to put it in S because it still has this weird evil elf visual. I don't know exactly if I like this visual for the tower, but it does look cool, and it is a really well-designed tower with a great animation, so it does go in A tier. And that is all the towers in all of the Kingdom Rush games rated by their design, how well I think they execute that design. And I'm just going to thank you so much for watching. Have a lovely day.